This is the Good Government Podcast with Aaron Slutkin and Michael Hoffpower.
So we started first recording an episode for a program we're affiliated with. And we sat down and couldn't figure out what we were going to do, but we ended up speaking about the 10th Federalist paper. Had a long conversation and figured we needed to do more of this. And after that, you had the idea, Mike, of a podcast about education. You and I are both educators. I'm a high school teacher. You teach undergraduates, and taking texts that we think are especially rich and analyzing them, but also talking about why they're worth teaching and how we teach them. Do I have that right?
Yeah, and I really appreciate this, how we teach them, because how we teach them is part of the conversation of how it is that you and I as individuals might think about them. What's most important is how you would think about what's being argued by quite intelligent people who care about the lives of others as well as their own lives. So that's what's most important. We want to talk about how you would teach these things, so we can talk about how you want to think about these things. And that matters because now they are yours to accept or jettison as you see fit in your personal life and political life.
One of the reasons why we want to start with the Federalist is because it is itself very obviously a work of education. Talk for a second, please. What is the Federalist?
Federalist is a series of 85 papers, the overwhelming majority of which were published in newspapers out of New York in defense of the Constitution and actually protesting in a very positive way, petitioning, I should say, the American people to ratify the Constitution. It was an effort that's so successful that we understand the Constitution of the United States to be the only Constitution, even though one could rightly argue that it's the second Constitution after the Articles of Confederation. But that's how you know they succeeded. We don't even think about the Articles. So you ask what they are. They're in defense of the Constitution, and they also offer us a very, very fine-tooth understanding of the principles of the Constitution and the mechanics or institutions of the United States Constitution. So you want to understand the Constitution and also something of America and her people. The Federalist Papers are a fantastic place to start. It's my argument that there is by all means, and I think plenty of other people argue this as well, I join them, there is by all means a political science in the Federalist Papers. There is an understanding of how human beings ought to live together as a community, oriented or situated around some understanding of the purposes of government, and therewith something to do with the purposes of human life. That's serious stuff now.
You note there that the Federalist is not only an effort to persuade the people of the state of New York to send delegates to state conventions that will ratify the Constitution. You know that there's something more eternal about it, that it is political science that can speak to us in our day. I read this morning a letter from Washington to Hamilton. The date is August 1788. So this is, I think, after the New York Convention has met, or at least after the Federalist has ceased publication in New York newspapers. Washington wrote, "When the transient circumstances and fugitive performances which attended this crisis," that's underlined, "shall have disappeared, that work, the Federalist, will merit the notice of posterity, because in it are candidly discussed the principles of freedom and the topics of government, which will always be interesting to mankind, so long as they shall be connected in civil society." So as long as freedom and the topics of government are topics under discussion, then the Federalist has something for us.
That's wonderful. That should be considered alongside probably the farewell address, that letter to Madison, where when Madison's going to the convention in Philadelphia, he says, you cannot adopt some temporizing expedient.
Yeah.
The whole Articles of Confederation has to be thrown away. We have to remake this government. And in fact, we have to remake this government as one which is energetic. So already one of the first challenges, forgive me if I'm getting ahead of where the conversation is going, but the challenge now that we have from our principled concern with freedom as the necessary launch pad of all human endeavor. Freedom is not the end, but it sure is important, because everything else we're going to do issues from being free to do so, to choose to behave or live our lives as we would see fit. This is liberal stuff right here in the terms of liberty. But what we also now have to do is secure that freedom, which requires a government that possesses seemingly qualities which are seemingly antithetical to freedom, namely energy. So having an energetic government, let me just be very clear, a powerful government that can do things, seems antithetical to living freely. Because you would say, well, if I want to live freely, we just got rid of this king who is all up in our business. I want to live freely. So what I want is no government. Leave me alone. Well, that's not sufficient for securing the basis of all human endeavor, it seems to me, freedom. So we've now got to combine energy and liberty into this strange thing and try to make good government. Now, there are going to be other parts of the schema to try and make good government, but that's at least what I want to say right now. And to help us understand how these things are compatible and choice-worthy, to return to the question of education here, I argue, and so do others, that there's a civic education in the Federalist Papers. So we have to understand that actually an energetic government is necessary and good, not in itself, but because it is capable of securing our liberty. That's why it's good. And then certain habits of mind, maybe even what we would say aspects of our character, must be formed. And that's not simply Publius's political science, but his statecraft, crafting our souls. So now what I would argue is that the two of us can benefit from the Federalist Papers because they will help us understand how it is that we ought to live, view ourselves and view others according to Publius. And we have to say, well, maybe he's wrong about things. Maybe he's completely right, but we should always, in my opinion, read things as if they're correct. Try our best to understand them. And then once we're confident we understand them, we can say, well, I don't think this is correct in this or that way.
You used two terms so far that I want to clarify, liberal and civic education. Again, you and I are both educators. I teach U.S. history and American government and world cultures and religions to ninth graders and 11th graders. And I think I conceive more of my role as a civic educator, at least in those U.S. history and American government classes. I'm not afraid of using words like love in my American government and American history class. Yesterday, I was with my American government freshmen. I have 10 students this year, and we're all sitting around a little seminar table. Put your heads down, raise your hand if you love America. And maybe 8 or 9 of them raise their hands, and then they have to answer why. And I tell them that you really can't love something if you want to think about your father or your mother or your boyfriend or your girlfriend. You really can't love something unless you actually know it. So I think civic education is in some ways trying to come to a justification of love.
A sort of enlightened patriotism,
Sure,
is the turn of phrase. I loved this thing, and then I studied it or learned about it or understood it better, and now I really love it. I know why I love it, why it's lovable. That's a beautiful thing. Why did you have them put their head? You said I had them put their heads down.
yes.
Why'd you do that?
Did it because I didn't want anyone's, in a small class where most of these students know each other, I did it because I didn't want anyone's answer to influence the other.
Mm-hmm.
A secret ballot. And it's very helpful for me if I'm going to spend, 85, over 100 class hours with them to be able to pick out the student who didn't raise his hand and say, okay, let's watch what we're working with here.
So already you understand something about people and education, concern with how one appears to other, peer pressure. What is then overall the point of liberal education as far as you understand it? You've already said something of civic education, but how does that relate to liberal education? Let me define it. Liberal education is, as the cliche says, teaching people how to think. Liberal education is the education befitting a free human being. Liberal education is an education in self-government. Is there something that I'm missing in my definition? How do you understand it?
No, I don't think so. But I think the context here makes things difficult, right? My job is to teach students how to think, yes, but I also have to, at least the way that I approach my work, I think that there are certain things that a student should know before he leaves my classroom and therefore high school. And I say he because I teach at an all-boys school. Occasionally we have an exchange with a co-ed school. So normally my standpoint is he rather than he and she. There's certain things a boy should know. There are, in pedagogy, we might call them competencies, but let's use the broad term liberal education. That one is more difficult to me. When I taught English for a year, we read The Odyssey and Macbeth in one semester. And I think in that context, I had a very easy time getting them to think about right and wrong, about conscience, about what life they wanted to live. But in a U.S. history class or an American government class, that's a lot more difficult. I think it is, at least. I also teach world religions, and I offer Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Sikhism, Taoism, Buddhism as ways of life that my students can seriously consider. Ultimately, the consideration that I bring to them is that if you want to learn something about yourself, whether they're white, black, or Indian, or whatever, then these texts have something to offer you. So stick around. I try to put myself as little between the text and the student as possible. So my way of teaching world religions isn't to give them a textbook on Judaism. We are going to read this year Genesis and Exodus and so on. But I generally think of my job more as civic educator in those history and government classes than as liberal educator. Although maybe I have it wrong. Maybe you already know I'm doing something I'm not.
I've been trying to flesh out this argument that in America, in our liberal democracy, civic education is the handmaid of liberal education. The two can cohere, whereas liberal education is greater and overall what we're really concerned with. Nonetheless, there's a lovely feedback loop insofar as the free human being who is capable of self-government is the type of human being we need for a government that depends upon the people governing themselves.
Right.
So I apologize for that feedback loop, but that seems to me to be what it is. And you've also added more to our definition of liberal education, namely helping human beings become cognizant of human possibility, of what greatness is. Just think of the first time you saw a beautiful piece of art. For instance, I always thought Jackson Pollock's art was unimpressive, to be very nice about it. And then in D.C. one year at the museum, which had a modern wing, saw this great, huge painting. That took me back to the woods by Ben Evans's house, where we used to just go and play for years as we were children. It took me immediately to these woods that I had completely forgotten about, and a sort of youthful experience, a youthful innocence, a spirit of exploration, and also friendship. It helped me transcend my silly concerns at the time and remind me of certain possibilities that I had sort of forgotten about. To say nothing of then if you're going to read about Alexander or Cyrus or any of these amazing people. On the other hand, I would say liberal education, while the human possibilities are not exhausted in the great, the human possibilities exist in the mundane and also in the depths of just human malice and hatred and jealousy. So you're reading Hamlet, so you did all of this. You're reading the Odyssey, you understand the range of human possibility in a much more significant way. And therefore you are opened up. You are opened up to the whole of which you are a part. And finally, we have to hope certain things are ignited or spurred inside of these young people, namely ambition, philanthropy, that is to say, a genuine love of their fellow human beings. And then they can deliberate about it, what to do, choose as is befitting a free person, and then go out there and work at the soup kitchen, go out there and build a house, go out there and become a teacher, go vote, whatever. So I think liberal education, again, look at how we backed into civic education, how we backed into something else. I think this is very important This is why we can't have an instrumentalized view of education. Look, I think it's very important. I mean, I very much respect and see as an honorable way to live one's life picking up a trade. I'm a minute away from doing it almost every day. But viewing the university or college simply as a place where you go get a degree so you can then go just work at one of these places and just make money. Well, that's good because money allows one to do things, and that's good. If you do those things, then they're choice-worthy and good. But we have lost the sense that we need to have a core liberal arts education that has a civic education component to it in order to help those people do well and choose well with that money that they're making, with the line of work they're going to go into, as opposed to just simply making people who go into whatever profession they're going to go into. So I think it's a very important question that a lot of people are concerned with and answering in positive ways nowadays. Thank goodness.
So I don't want to ask a question right now that's too big for the little bit of text that we want to work on. We know that there's a civic education in the Federalist, or at least you've suggested there is, and I think down the road we'll come to it. Is there additionally a liberal education in the Federalist, or is asking that question all still convoluting the difference between a liberal and civic education, which in a republic where we govern ourselves is less distinct than it might be in another regime?
Yeah, sure. And let me be as clear as I can. That maybe would help with the question a little bit. We as friends who will learn from each other and as individuals need to think about and decide whether the whole of the human being, human flourishing, is exhausted in political life, or whether there's something in what we would call private life that is higher than political life, no matter the heights of people like Publius, like Madison, Jay, and Hamilton. So that's a place I would start to go in thinking about this personally. But I think the way in which our civic education in the Federalist Papers looks like, or is liberal education, is because you were called upon to deliberate, is the way that Fed 1 is going to open. Well, you don't ask a human being who is enslaved to deliberate and choose. You call upon a free person whose choice matters. So it's rooted in an understanding of human dignity and what it is to be a human being. Namely, a human being who by justice consents to be governed. So there's already a liberal understanding in the civic education. The principles are liberal principles that are at work throughout the Federalist Papers, in my opinion. And to use an image regarding the liberal education that Publius offers throughout the Federalist Papers, think about leading a horse to water. So much of that, I think, describes what liberal education is. Publius does not dunk our heads into the water and force us to drink throughout the Federalist Papers. Instead, he leads us to the water. He shapes our understanding of the ends of government and what it takes to meet those ends or purposes of government. He also shapes our understandings of the arguments surrounding the Constitution, both for and against it. Finally, he shapes also, and most importantly, I think, our understandings of human beings, that is to say, of ourselves. And he helps us reflect on the qualities of human beings which are desirable and which must be guarded against for good government. So the way that Publius teaches us to think about this is soft in a way. It's respectful in a way. While Publius can be quite aggressive, especially with his opponents at certain points, regarding the enlightened friends of liberty, he'll use these turn of phrases, regarding everyone who seems to be on his side or who he would have come onto his side. He treats respectfully as a person who is free and therefore needs to be persuaded of the arguments. Now, sometimes, of course, his rhetoric is a little, sometimes his rhetoric varies. I guess I could say it that way. And sometimes the arguments are clearer and sometimes they're less clear. Sometimes they play more on our emotions and sometimes more on our reason. But all the same, Publius allows us to come to these conclusions on our own. That's the hallmark of liberal education. It's not mere rote repetition of a formula. It needs to be something that we purchase with our own hearts and minds. And that's what liberal education is. And that's what Publius, I think, offers us throughout the Federalist Papers. What do you think about that? Is that a bridge too far, or what do you think?
Well, I don't think so. The Federalist right is aimed ostensibly at a narrow piece of persuasion. Not that the task of self-government is narrow, but at least that's what Publius sets out to do, to convince the people of the state of New York to elect delegates who will vote to ratify the Constitution. And at the same time, we can look at who Publius is and suggest that he has some teaching about the Constitution itself, right? A teaching that if Washington is correct, then down the road, two guys filming something called a podcast will have some use for, or that students in a classroom will have use for, or academics or something like that. It's interesting. There is, in this first Fed paper, I don't think there is a sense that this is a work meant for eternity. Maybe that comes later in the Federalist.
Yeah, what is time? This is an awesome way to think about it. I hadn't quite done this before, because when we read the Declaration, we pay attention to time in the course of human events. So time is the setting, any place. Since you brought up Hamlet, I'm just thinking about Shakespeare already. It's all, you've got to do the setting. Anytime you're going to write a movie or a screenplay or a story, it sure does help, unless you're doing some real interesting fiction. Time and place and who. That's what you've got to do. So what is the time of Fed 1? The time is now. And it's urgent. And there's a lot at stake. You are called upon to deliberate, and it's the fate of humankind hangs in the balance. Is self-government possible? What's remarkable, and I really appreciate your point that you're helping me see it this way, there's no question. Right now, you have to decide. But the question of is self-government possible is not a dead question. That question is as alive as you and I are right now. And it will always be, I think. So the time is now for all of those human beings who are going to vote to ratify or not ratify the Constitution, and it's alive for the two of us. Can we govern ourselves? What does good government look like according to this guy Publius? That's very helpful for me. I appreciate that.
And Publius is talking about a crisis, right? So the first Fed paper, the people of the state of New York, after an unequivocal experience of the inefficacy of the subsisting federal government, you are called upon to deliberate on a new constitution for the United States of America. We are at a particular moment of time later in the paragraph. He is going to call this a crisis. It speaks to the existence of the Union, the safety and welfare of the parts of which it is composed, the fate of an empire, in many respects the most interesting in the world. And it seems like there's a turn here. Maybe he's still speaking of the crisis in these more temporal terms. It has been frequently remarked that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country, by their good conduct and example, to decide the important question, whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. That is a larger question than whether or not we are going to choose the new Constitution.
Beautiful, right? I see your point. That's another way of moving from the immediacy to the eternity of human existence as far as we know it, however limited or long it might be. What you've just read to us is the most famous section of Fed 1. Can we establish good government? Well, that depends on what good government is. What is good government? As we will see when we get to Federalist Paper 37, Publius articulates the various parts of good government. Stability, energy, liberty, and the Republican form comprise good government there. But we have to understand that to call anything good, a good dog, a good friend, a good meal, means we have to understand what the purpose of those things are. Guard me well, love me well, make me feel a certain way, and provide me energy, respectively, for those three things. Well, what are the purposes or ends of government? It's one thing to say stability, energy, liberty, and the Republican form, but I have to know what the purpose of government is in order to define good government. Wouldn't I say that good government, good American government, is that which is capable of securing our liberty, securing our natural rights, making the space for me to pursue happiness, securing the space for me to pursue happiness, securing me in my property, securing me in my ability to practice religion as I see fit, and so on and so forth. And what's interesting about the latter points is you realize that good government in the American context is about me as an individual. It's about you as an individual, Aaron. And we will have to be certain sorts of people to own up to those ends of government ourselves. That's part of the education that's offered throughout the Federalist Papers, and I think throughout so much of American history from our great statesmen and great thinkers. What is good government? Is it just the institutions and the laws? Is it just the Constitution as written law? It is that, but it's not just that. What about good government as far as you being a good person? We would have to understand the ends of the person, the purpose of a person, the goals of the person, the good of the person. In the American context, we can at least say that that person is capable of self-government. It means that that person lives according to reason in some part, while not forgetting that that person is also passionate. But can those passions and can that reason align towards a sort of civic spiritedness, some sense of duty that attends that sense of rights? We'll see certain virtues built throughout the Federalist Papers. One of my favorite ones, jealousy. We'll see a sort of vigilant and manly spirit spoken of. So there are certain aspects of us that are needed for our good government of ourselves. But I think this opens us now into a much broader consideration. This is why we should consider things from the Nicomachean Ethics, things from the Bible, things from literature, as well as engage in some comparative studies of other forms of government. What is good government? As far as regimes go and institutions in those regimes go, what is good government as far as human beings go, who live well or live poorly?
Well, and Mike, it's not just literature. Let's consider the study of history. We can learn from that greatest oracle experience when it's time to go to bat for the things that are worth dying for. We can look for examples of men trying to create the things that we hold dear and to consult them and to learn which way to go and which way not to go.
I agree completely, Aaron. Welcome to Good Government Podcast, a program on politics, philosophy, literature, and history. We're going to take up the study of these most important things, both in terms of regime and in terms of the way that we as human beings live our lives from various perspectives in our time together. I'm really looking forward to it, Aaron. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Mike, thank you.
This has been the Good Government Podcast with Aaron Slutkin and Michael Hoffpower.